A History of Oregon. Chapter 5. Having briefly traced the operations of the two foreign fur companies in Oregon, a knowledge of the location of their several trading establishments will enable the reader to comprehend their power and influence in the country. Fort Umpqua was located in the extreme southwestern part of Oregon, near the mouth of the river bearing that name. It was a temporary stockade built of logs, overlooking a small farm in its immediate vicinity, was generally occupied by a clerk and from 4 to 8 Frenchmen. Fort George, Astoria, already described. They had a farm and small establishment at the mouth of the Cowlitz, and a more extensive farm some 25 miles up that river. Fort Vancouver, a stockade, 6 miles above the mouth of the Multnomah, or Willamette River. This fort was the general depot for the southwestern department, at which their goods for Indian trade were landed, and their furs and peltries collected and shipped to foreign markets. There was also a trading house at Champoeg, some 35 miles up the Willamette River. On the left bank of the Columbia River, near the 46 degrees of north latitude, stood Fort Nez Perces, called Walla Walla, now Wallula, a stockade, accidentally burned in 1841, and rebuilt with adobes in 1841-2. On the left bank of the south branch of the Columbia, or Snake River, at the junction of the Boise, was located Fort Boise, built formerly, in 1834, with poles, later, with adobes. Continuing up Snake River to the junction of the Portneuf, on its left bank we find Fort Hall, built by Captain Wyeth, a stockade in 1834, rebuilt by the Hudson's Bay Company, with adobes, in 1838. Thence up the Columbia, Fort Okanagan, at the mouth of Okanagan River, formerly a stockade, latterly a house or hut, and up the Spokane some 20 miles, was the old Spokane Fort, built by Astor's Company, a stockade with solid bastions. Continuing up the Columbia to Kettle Falls, and 2 miles above, on the left bank is Fort Colville, formerly a stockade, still occupied by the Hudson's Bay Company. Thence up the Columbia to the mouth of the Kootenai River, near the 49th parallel of latitude, is the trading establishment called Kootenai House. Thence returning south, and ascending the Flathead, Clarks, and Kootenai rivers, into what is now Montana Territory, is, or was, the hut called Flathead House. Still higher up on the Columbia was a small establishment, called the Boat Encampment, or Mountain House. Entering the country by the Straits of Juan de Fuca and Puget Sound, we find Fort Nasqualla, formerly a stockade. Proceeding up Fraser River to near the 49th parallel, upon the left or south bank of the river is Fort Langley, an extensive stockade. Thence up that river about 90 miles, half a mile below the mouth of the Coquihalla, is Fort Hope, a stockade. On the right bank of the Fraser, 16 miles above, is Fort Yale, a trading house. Thence proceeding up the Fraser, and onto the waters of Thompson River, is Fort Kamloops. Still further north and east, extending into New Caledonia, are Forts Alexander, William, Gary, and Abercrombie. On the southeastern part of Vancouver Island is Fort Victoria, formerly a stockade. On the north side of the island is Fort Rupert, a stockade, still in good repair. On the mainland, near Portland Channel, is Fort Simpson. At the mouth of the Steeken River, on Dundas Island, was formerly Fort Wrangell, a stockade. Recently the establishment has been removed some 60 miles up the Steeken River, and called Fort Steeken. This, as will be seen, gives the company 23 forts and 5 trading stations. In addition to these they had trading parties extending south to California, southeast to Fort Hall and into Utah and Arizona, east into the Blackfoot Country, Montana, and the Rocky Mountains, and north into New Caledonia and along the northwestern watershed of the Rocky Mountains. They also had 2 steamers, the Beaver and Otter, to enter all the bays, harbors, rivers, and inlets along the western coast of our country, from Mexico on the south, to Russian America on the north, employing 55 officers and 513 articled men, all bound, under the strictest articles of agreement, to subserve the interests of that company under all circumstances, being strictly forbidden to acquire any personal or real estate outside of their stipulated pay as servants of the company, and were subject to such punishment for deficiency of labor or neglect of duty as the officer in charge might see fit to impose, having no appeal to any source for redress, as the original charter of Charles II, confirmed by Act of Parliament in 1821, clearly conferred on the company absolute control over the country they occupied, and all in it. As a matter of romance and adventure, many statements are made of conflicts with Indians and with wild animals, all terminating favorably to the interests of the company, confirming and strengthening their absolute power over all their opponents, but as they do not properly belong to a work of this character, they will be omitted, except where they may be brought to illustrate a fact, or to prove the principles and policy of the company. As in the case of Mr. Black, a chief trader at Fort Kamloops, who had offended an Indian, the Indian disguised his resentment, entered the fort as a friend, and while Mr. Black was passing from the room in which the Indian had been received, he was deliberately shot by him, and fell dead. The Indian fled, and the fort was closed against the tribe. Not a single article of trade or supplies was allowed to the tribe till the murderer was given up, and hung by the company's men, when the fort was opened and trade resumed. In another case, near the mouth of the Columbia, a trader by the name of McKay was killed in a drunken row with the Indians at a salmon fishery. A friendly Indian gave information at headquarters, when an expedition was fitted out and sent to the Indian camp. The murderer, with a few other Indians, was found in a canoe, but escaped to shore. They were fired at, and one woman was killed and others wounded. Dr. McLaughlin, being in command of the party, informed the Indians that if the murderer was not soon given up, he would punish the tribe. They soon placed the murderer in the hands of the party, who were satisfied of the guilt of the Indian, and at once hung him, as an example of the punishment that would be inflicted upon murderers of white men belonging to the company. One other instance of daring and summary punishment is related as having been inflicted by Mr. Douglas, while in charge of a fort in the midst of a powerful tribe of Indians. A principal chief had killed one of the company's men. Mr. Douglas, learning that he was in a lodge not far from the fort, boasting of his murderous exploit, armed himself, went to the lodge, identified the murdering chief, and shot him dead, then walked deliberately back to the fort. A compliance with licensed parliamentary stipulations would have required the arrest of the murderers in all these cases, and the testimony and criminals to be sent to Canada for conviction and execution. These cases illustrate, whether just or otherwise, the absolute manner of dealing with Indians by the company. The following chapter gives us the particulars of an aggravated case of brutal murder of the person in charge of one of their extreme northwestern forts by the men under his charge.